In this video, we're going to take a closer look at the execution context dialog for a non-virtualized test scenario. In this example, we're using this scenario LGI cas01.scenario with the corresponding .context file. Double-clicking this context file will open the execution context dialog, or I open the scenario file and use the execute scenario button or any other way known to me to execute a test scenario, which will then open up the corresponding execution context dialog. There are several tabs in this dialog. For non-virtualized tests, the set of tabs may vary depending on the type of program and type of test scenario that we define. Specifically, we see the second tab, SQL select/update. This tab only occurs if we have made use of the SQL select or the SQL update palette element in defining our test scenario, which is the case here to show you the full extent of the execution context dialog. Let's start with the environment tab. As discussed elsewhere with regards to environments for non-virtualized test scenarios, we select the host, the connection ID, and if there are more than one environments being defined for a given connection, then we also need to select the environment. So in this example, we have selected the LPAR CWCC, and as discussed elsewhere, in this specific environment, we have two environments for this connection, CWCC batch and CWCC6. And since LGI cas01, the program in question, is a CICS program, we select the CICS environment. The logging information, the logging level of info should not be changed unless instructed by our BMC support to do so when analyzing issues with total test. And typically for non-virtualized test scenarios, we would be using the component data from the repository to load all metadata information for the program we want to test. There are rare occasions in which you don't want to do that and specify and deviate from that data. As mentioned, we are using SQL select and update palette elements in this specific test scenario. Therefore, we need to select the DB2 location name to which we want to connect. In the repository, we store the information which default DB2 location name to use. Since we are not deviating from that default in our environment, we can leave the default as it is. Otherwise, you would have to specify the location name of a separate DB2 subsystem on that LPAR. The functional test tab gives us information about the component or the components under test being referenced in this test scenario by the functional test element. Here we're testing one component, LGI cas01, with its corresponding internal ID. And on the lower table, you see the metadata that has been loaded from the repository for this specific program. So for example, we will execute in the DB2 subsystem DBCC using the DB2 plan GENA1 in the CICS region HCC A013 and so on. If required, you can modify these settings by clicking the edit button and change any of these names, as I said, if required, and if you need to deviate from the defaults read from the repository. Usually this should not be necessary, but there are situations in which you may want to deviate. Next, we come to the options. After execution of your test scenario, do you want to upload your results to the repository server so that you can review your test results on the web repository server? Nowadays, this functionality is not used very frequently. Job accounting information is applicable in a similar fashion as to what we discussed about virtualized tests. So if you need to specify an accounting information to be able to execute JCL on your mainframe system, you can specify the job accounting information here. Completion timeout, 600 seconds is the default, 10 minutes. How long do we want to wait for the test scenario to finish before the dialog will give up waiting for the test scenario? 10 minutes should be enough in most cases. If that's not enough time for a given scenario, you can extend the time. The JCL skeleton folder is primarily being used for the execution of virtualized test scenarios, but you can execute virtualized test scenarios from within a non-virtualized test scenario. Therefore, we need to be able to specify a JCL skeleton folder if we do not want to use the runner JCL from the repository or the central total test configuration project. Dataset high-level qualifier. We have discussed elsewhere that this qualifier can be defined in the repository or the local total test configuration project. Should you have to deviate from this qualifier value for a given test scenario or a given user to be able to allocate temporary data sets, then you can specify this qualifier on this context level. In this example and this video, we're going to skip code coverage. There will be extra videos dedicated specifically to the topic of code coverage. And lastly, we have the tab for context variables. In this specific example, we are not using context variables. I refer you to the video about virtualized test scenarios and the execution context dialog for virtualized test scenarios to get an example, to see an example of how to use context variables in a context.